cute puppy. It's like a year old or so.
All right, we're live.
Well, all right. Hello, everybody. I'll go ahead and stop sharing here. Hi, welcome to Office Hours. My name is Brennan Breed. And I am am I on the delay there? Sorry. Yeah, my name is Brennan Breed. I'm Associate Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary. And I am a theologian in residence at First Presbyterian Church, Marietta. And I'm so happy to be here with Chris Holmes. And Chris, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey, good morning, everyone. That was my echo. That's my fault. I was pulling up the Facebook live stream on my computer, and I was getting the delay, and it took me a second. But yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris, and I'm the Stembler Scholar in Residence and Director of Biblical and Theological Education at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And I'm fortunate to be in the abandoned church this morning in my office, and didn't have to spend nearly as much time figuring out the right camera angle as I did last week. So, you know, that's a win. That's a net gain for this week, no matter what happens.
And then we welcome today our good friend Jeanette Oak, Professor of New Testament at Azusa Pacific University and Seminary. And Jeanette, we are the most amazing thing about all of this. Jeanette is a wonderful biblical scholar, a very funny person, a lover of schnauzers, which she's in good company here. But most incredibly, on the West Coast right now.
That's right.
I think is it 3 o'clock or 4? What time is it over there? Actually,
it feels like 3, but it's 6:30.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, well, Brennan, you've never been good at math, I guess. You know how time zones work?
I'm a biblical scholar. I mean, you know, I teach Hebrew. I count with like letters. You know, I don't know anything about numbers. But in any event, Jeanette, thank you so much for joining us and for being here, and welcome to Office Hours. And we are grateful for having you here for a number of different reasons. But one thing, it's really fun to kind of interact with people who have different research on different parts of the New Testament. You know, I'm an Old Testament guy, so this is all kind of out of my field of specialty. But for you, you research a letter. Well, you research a lot of things in the New Testament, but one of the things you focused on in your research is a letter that most people haven't really read much, right? And that's First Peter. Although I taught about it in my church class this last week, and I read, by the way, your stuff from Working Preacher, which was really good. Let me recommend, by the way, Jeanette's articles on Working Preacher. You've got a couple in there, but a couple I read on First Peter were.
I think it was 1 Peter 1:17 through 23, and then 1 Peter 2:19 through 25.
Yes. So pretty much all the stuff that was interesting that I said, I mentioned your name, by the way. I said, I got all this from Jeanette Oak. But anyway, but so it's
somebody read it.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, there's a lot of comments on there, by the way. I don't know if you've seen it. But all to say, First Peter is a fascinating letter. And I was just going to ask you, before we jump into Philippians, can you just give us a brief introduction to some of your research, but also some of the ways that maybe First Peter might be able to speak to our own context today?
Yeah, well, first, I'm glad to hear you're reading First Peter. And I think it's an overlooked book for preaching and teaching. It's a great text to read with your congregations. So I highly recommend it. But one of the things that I thought would be relevant with the intersection of First Peter and COVID, as we're now experiencing, is so cultural homelessness is a major theme in First Peter. And the author is both describing and prescribing his readers' exceptional relationship to God, and his strange relationship with society, when addressing his letters as to the elect who are living as foreigners of the diaspora, or in the diaspora. And so he addresses Christians as elect or eklektoi in the sense that they're chosen by God to live a life set apart for God among the races, the nations, the people. And this is just like how God selected and gathered Israel from among all races, nations, and people of the earth. And so by calling his readers resident aliens and foreigners, I'm arguing that the author desires to help them understand themselves vis-a-vis or in the face of the prevailing Gentile values and way of life. And so, for example, he talks about being built into a spiritual house and constituting the household of God. In doing so, believers are to experience at-homeness among fellow believers and no longer feel at home among the Gentiles. Now, this is a strategy that's effective for people who are too at home in the dominant culture, right? So when taking metaphorically in relation to the elect, that the phrase like resident aliens and foreigners, it does offer a glimpse of their social alienation and the marginalization that they experience as a result of being born anew, their divinely chosen status. And so while that language is figurative, their social conflict isn't, right? There's a difference between the language being figurative of being a foreigner, resident alien, and their conflict as being actually very real. And later in the letter, it becomes apparent that these believers are beleaguered. They are beset by social hostility, conflict, slander, persecution from non-Christian neighbors, governors, masters, husbands, etc. And so the language of living as elect foreigners in the diaspora, it does serve sociological purposes. And the idea that Christians are perpetual foreigners in a land in which they no longer feel at home, that has an effect. It helps equip believers with like the theological and emotional narrative to interpret their suffering and to better endure it. Now, if in effect, the author of 1 Peter is encouraging believers to live as perpetual foreigners, self-inflicted, I guess you could say, then I wanted to read that in light of the cultural stereotype of the perpetual foreigner that has been persistently imposed upon ethnic minorities in the US, particularly Asian Americans. Right. And so I don't know if you're familiar with this stereotype, but for our readers or listeners, the stereotype interrogates the identity of those who understand themselves to be as American as their European American counterparts, but who are perceived by both Black and white Americans to be less American. And so I'm not going to go into all the details, but like research in social dominance theory suggests that just by simply being a member of an ethnic minority can lead people to experience a decreased sense of belonging to the nation and to the American mainstream culture. And there's also some recent psychological studies that suggest that when American ethnic minorities are frequently perceived as foreigners and denied like American status or in-group status, they often experience a greater sense of cultural homelessness and conflict about their national identity. And so hopefully you'll see where I'm going here, but such findings do have implications for the ways in which ethnic minority groups, and I would say particularly Asian Americans, participate in civic society and experience this sense of perpetual foreignness. And I also argue that it ironically suggests the potential success of the strategy that the author offers his beleaguered addressees, right? It helps to help them cope with social hostility and alienation, but that's resulting from their conversion and from their engagement with non-believers. But they're trying to disengage from the dominant cultural values that are no longer appropriate or befitting the people of God. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the author of 1 Peter's strategy is one that needs to be appropriated with a double vision for Asian Americans. Since others already perceive them as literal foreigners, okay, this contributes to their difficulties with psychological adjustment and withdrawal from active political and civic engagement. So like, contrary to the way the idea of living as perpetual foreigners functions in 1 Peter as like a self-designation, I said self-imposed earlier, but to build a stronger sense of in-group identity and encourage appropriate interaction with non-believers, the image of the perpetual foreigner functions for Asian Americans really differently. It's a negative stereotype imposed upon them. And the stereotype, it coupled with the theological language of being resident aliens and foreigners, further marginalizes Asian Americans and encourages a position of civic and political withdrawal, while at the same time strengthening their in-group and religious group identity. So that double-edged sword. And why this is significant, or something I've been thinking about and writing about, is that in light of COVID, we find the surgence of the perpetual foreigner stereotype. In his recent online essay, The Perpetual Foreigner Virus, he called it PVF, NT scholar Ekaputra Tupamahu, he reminds us that the perpetual foreigner stereotype is alive and well, spreading like a wildfire during the COVID-19 pandemic. So think about just how it was insisted upon for a while that COVID-19, at least from our president, be called, I should go back. earlier in the coverage of COVID-19, the virus is referred to as the Wuhan virus, or the Chinese virus, or the foreign virus. You have to ask yourself, like, foreign to what? Foreign to America? Well, then why are Asian Americans experiencing racial profiling and a resurgent, maybe you could say discrimination, or foreign to whiteness, right? We find that the perpetual foreigner stereotype continues to be a dangerous problem. And so it's not that racism against Asian Americans is new or unique because of the coronavirus. It's just that people are becoming more aware of it. So since I think right now the confirmed number of COVID cases is higher in Western countries than in China. And yet the question why Asian Americans are being targeted as being more contagious or more likely to spread the virus is very interesting. One has to think, why? There were over 1,000 reports of discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders as of April 15th. 1,497 was the last number I got. And for example, a stabbing of a 2-year-old Asian girl at Sam's Club in Texas, or some guy an Asian man was sprayed with Febreze in a New York subway. And so it's real, this stereotype of the professional foreigner. And so lastly, just in terms of what I've been thinking about and writing about, is the author of 1 Peter levels a powerful critique, I would say, to maybe I could say white American evangelical Christians who tend to conflate religious, ethnic, and national identity because of their dominant racial and religious place in society. Yet for Asian American Christians who desire to shed that stereotype of the perpetual foreigner and be perceived by others as at home and belonging in America, the letter's author's strategy is more problematic, as we see in the rearing of the perpetual foreigner stereotype's head during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's just one snippet, a long-winded one.
Thanks for that. I mean, I appreciate just the clarity of how you've engaged what is a major theme in 1 Peter, and how that major theme and major ethical exhortation can be an overly burdensome requirement for Asian Americans who are trying to, they already exist as that perpetual foreigner, and how easy it is for someone like me whose citizenship in this country will never be questioned because of the way that I embody myself. And so, you know, that exhortation almost becomes like pious. You know, I'm separating myself. I'm called to live as an alien and stranger, without sort of that realization that not only the recipients of 1 Peter, but also 21st century readers are struggling with feeling at home in the country that they call their own. And how that's a sort of a double tension with reading a biblical text. Thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. And there are some themes that you can see in your work in 1 Peter and Philippians, but also maybe some differences too in the way that Paul is thinking about unity and honor and status and belonging and so on, but also the citizenship language that we see in Philippians, and the kind of some of this kind of striving or fighting imagery that we see in our text for today. So today we had Philippians chapter 1 verse 27 all the way through to chapter 2 verse 18, and we've got kind of two sections of material there. At the beginning and the end, we have Paul's kind of exhortations to the community of the Philippians. And then sandwiched in between, we have this really interesting and beautiful and strange, maybe perhaps hymn, a song, right, about Jesus's descent and exaltation. And in a way, like the big question of today can be, how do we understand this text, this hymn, which has been so important for Christian theology throughout the ages, but also how do we understand it in context in the middle of Paul's arguments? And maybe we can start by unpacking just a little bit of some of this beginning of the exhortation in chapter 27. I mean, chapter 1, verse 27 and 28, and then we can maybe move to the hymn. Is that all right with you all?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's the beginning in chapter 1, verse 27, only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. This is perhaps a strange translation. I don't, maybe not a strange translation, but perhaps not a great translation. I was just, I'm an Old Testament person, so this is out of my ball game, out of my wheelhouse here. But only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ. That live your life seems to be a pretty loaded word. Now, you all probably know more about this than me, but I from my small amount of learning, recognize the word polis in there, which means like political or like citizenship, right? What do you all think about that being translated live your life, and what is this supposed to mean for Paul, you think?
Yeah. So I think you're right to sort of wonder about the translation. There are other words that Paul uses for sort of the way in which Christians are meant to conduct themselves. That is perhaps less politically geared or sort of gesturing towards that political environment. So this is the word politeusthai, that means sort of to conduct yourself as a citizen. It has a dual sense of both the rights and the duties responsible of citizenship. And, in the Roman world and in parts and corners of American culture, right, citizenship is something that is lorded over. It's something that it signals an elite status, particularly in Philippi, in ancient Philippi. It was one way that you could set yourself apart or above another person. And so when Paul is saying, live your life, he's more literally saying, live your life as a citizen of heaven. Conduct your life in a way that is worthy both of the rights and the duties of your citizenship in heaven. And in many ways, this sort of, I don't think it eliminates the concern for Roman citizenship, but it certainly puts it in contrast, right? So we have two forms of citizenship, we might say, and citizenship language is going to reoccur in 3:20 and other places in Philippians. It seems like it's a big thing, and I think it's more than just pretend like all that matters is heaven. I think it has some earthly. It has some earthly dirt to it, and manner that it's meant to make sense and demonstrate differently in a lived experience in the first century of Philippi. That's kind of where I would go with it. Anything to add to that, Jeanette?
Yeah, well, you're right. Like Paul elsewhere, like First Thessalonians, will use the word walk,
right,
when referring to how Christians are supposed to act or conduct themselves. So like 2:12 is walk in a manner worthy of God.
Yeah.
And there's that language in Ephesians. But in light of the fact that Philippi was a Roman colony,
right,
his word choice actually makes a lot of sense. To use live in the verb of being of citizenship, being like being citizens, or as like Nijay Gupta calls it, gospel citizens. Describes it like he's encouraging Christians to see themselves as gospel citizens. And just like a citizen of Rome is supposed to seek the welfare of the city, that was expected of all good Roman citizens. Yeah. So, and then, so the Christians are also to seek the welfare of the Christian community, not at the harm of of the larger society, but that they too are supposed to think not just about heaven, as you referred to in reference to 3:20, but also about how the gospel has social ramifications, community forming impact. And so one thing that's interesting is Philippi was like a Roman colony, and a lot of the free citizens or residents were considered Roman citizens. And they took this with a lot of pride. Its inhabitants modeled themselves after Rome. They were proud of their Romanness. They were patriotic, right? And
worship the emperor.
Yeah, right. So even there's more at stake at being patriotic and being look at us. We're such a good Roman colony.
Yeah.
And part of being Roman and Romanness was there is a preoccupation with status and privilege and honor.
Yeah.
That come to play later as we read on in chapter 2.
Yeah. Well, I
So
think
the allegiance isn't to Rome and Rome's way of seeking privilege, status, and honor, but to Christ and Christ's way.
yeah. I think one of the challenges that a lot of us 21st century readers of a text like Philippians, but this is true, I think, of Revelation as well and other parts of the New Testament, is we sort of take as self-evident that religion and politics are separate spheres of life. One is public, one is private. And it's always, for me, like a learning moment in my classes to say, this wasn't the case in the ancient world. And so to be a citizen of Rome entailed certain sort of religious practices, religious beliefs as well, and that then being a citizen of heaven would also, it's not only a religious matter, it's also a political matter. To say that Jesus is Lord is explicitly to say that Caesar is not, and to live worthy of the gospel, therefore, is highly political, as well as religiously significant.
And I would explain some of the more military language you alluded to, Brennan, about, like kind of like lockstep, being lockstep, arms linked. There is this aspect of conflict with outsiders or those who are not friends of the gospel or enemies of the gospel, Paul will later call them. And that's a difficult reality. But that's a reality that I also see in 1 Peter coming to play. When you are no longer living as you used to live and living according to new world order, new way of value system, new way of life, it comes into conflict with your family structure, your family values, your social norms, and things like that. That could create a lot of hostility and suffering as a result. So
yeah, it's one of the things I noticed in 1 Peter, but also in kind of in Philippians, is some of the politically dangerous stuff in the gospel, and that Paul and then also the author of 1 Peter seem to be kind of challenging people. Hey, do this in the right way, and maybe a challenge like for good things. The Christians kind of seem to attract, in the ancient world, seemed to attract attention because of how strange they were, and that they were, atheists because they said that the Roman gods didn't exist, and that they weren't good citizens because they weren't worshiping the emperor and worshiping the Roman gods that were understood to, everyone was in this together, right? We're all citizens. We all have to worship the same gods. We all have to pitch in together. And then these Christians are always like subtracting themselves, like not leaving before the sacrifices begin or whatever, but that they are attracting attention in kind of a negative way, and that there's this kind of way to live out your citizenship that might conflict with the empire, but in a way that is actually worthy, or like that matters. Make this count, in other words, is something that I hear Paul saying, and the author of 1 Peter. Yeah. And it's interesting too that like what counting seems to mean is like this a sense of koinonia, like be in this for one another and be in this together, and make sure that all the things you're doing are building one another up, instead of trying to like make yourself gain by it, right? This sense of kind of profiting, like, that Jesus isn't profiting off of his work, or that the Christian leaders, and Paul seems to say this a lot about himself, right? Like he says, like, I'm not profiting off of this, and also like I'm not in this for my own gain or my own fame or something, like, even though sometimes maybe it seems like he is, but all to say that seems to be in the background there. Is that right, or does that seem to influence this hymn at all, you think?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the idea of koinonia, again, I think so one New Testament scholar, Marcus Bachmiel, calls this whole passage sort of the centerpiece of Philippians, and that in this passage he says he sort of Paul spells out what progress in the gospel means. What does it mean to make progress in the gospel? We talked last week, Brennan, I think, about how we often think about the gospel as like a set of presuppositions that one sort of, accedes to mentally, and then you've, said the sinner's prayer and that's all good. And that for Paul, the gospel is much more dynamic. And so I think that the idea of working together, of being koinonia, and even considering the needs of others, as we'll see elsewhere in Philippians, is counter to an environment, a cultural environment that was, let me sort of get the next status by all means necessary. Let me get higher and higher and higher up in this hierarchy. And so as we consider the hymn, which we've gestured to, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows when we're talking about the hymn, we're talking about this part in verses 2:5 through 11 that is often broken out in Bibles because in an attempt to recognize sort of its more poetic structure, but that this idea of going opposite to maybe the desire to enter higher into the hierarchy is really modeled by this hymn about Jesus, and certainly Jesus is the sort of centerpiece of this moral exhortation in this letter, I think.
And Jeanette, you had mentioned too, and the sense of like kind of a oneness or unity. Also, First Peter talks a bit about unity and kind of togetherness and so on. But this kind of one mind in chapter 1, verse 27. Yeah, what is your take on that? What does this actually mean for Paul? Or what does it mean for us? Perhaps I could say too.
Actually, that word appears in First Peter chapter 3, like humble mind, being of humble mind. So the idea of the mind, of how you think, seems to be really important when it comes to unity, not only in Philippians, though it appears like multiple times in Philippians.
Right.
So I think 6 times in total, but phroneo. And what does that mean? Like, well, just phroneo, apart from one mind or the same mind. I appreciate how Elsa Thomas translates it as to think practically. And I think this is helpful because it refers to the mind and to thinking, but not just in reference to like a conceptual, doctrinal, theoretical, or existential activity, right? Phroneo has to do with not what one thinks only, but how one thinks, not just what one thinks.
Yeah.
It has to do with perspective and an attitude. Paul is encouraging believers to be united in their perspectives about themselves and of others, as we'll hint to when we get to the hymn, in light of Christ's perspective of himself and those he died for. And so that perspective is one of humility.
Right.
And they are to be united in their humble-mindedness. And we'll learn that Christ's humility is paradigmatic for Christian life. But it's not just like having the same opinions about what restaurant to go to and favorite foods, and the same view on all controversial doctrinal issues. No, I mean, obviously, if there's every knee shall bow and tongue will confess that Christ is Lord, there's going to be a diverse choir of witnesses worshiping Jesus as Lord. And so it's not going to be one language, one mind, the same thought. It has to do more with the non-negotiable, I think, worshiping Christ as a Lord who willingly took on the form of a slave, who humbled himself, becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Like that cross theology is like a non-negotiable, it seems. And that also has to do with their same-mindedness or being of one mind, I think.
Yeah, I mean, being a wisdom person, I study Old Testament wisdom literature primarily, so like Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the phroneo, always jumps out to me a bit. Like, I'm probably reading too much into this, but there is some like wisdom stuff in the background too of the Christ hymn. Thinking about like Proverbs chapter 8 and woman wisdom who works with God to create the world. I kind of see some of that in things like John 1, but also here in Philippians 2. But the sense that like wise people don't always necessarily think the same thing at the same time, but there is this kind of, like also Temez says, like a practice element to it, that they are, and that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, which actually occurs in this chapter 2, in the end of chapter 2. But all to say, thank you. That really helps me to understand about kind of thinking about doctrine versus thinking together, and like having a kind of a core common unity, that if we have a mind to be humble, that's going to lead perhaps to lots of different ways to think about God, but also perhaps to more unity than actually just a bunch of people who agree or to say the same thing over and over again. But in any event, so with that kind of background in mind, I'm just in light of time, should we move on to the hymn itself? It's kind of this fascinating and beautiful text, and kind of follows almost like a plot line, right? What are your initial reactions to the hymn? Like, what are some things that you think are important to bring out as we jump into the study of it?
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
either feel free.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, I think that one thing to sort of put out there is, there's at least a debate among New Testament scholars about whether or not this, I mean, there's debates in New Testament, in biblical scholarship, there's debates about everything, right? I mean, that's how you write articles, that's how you write books. But there's a number of important debates about this hymn. And the first is whether or not it's actually a hymn, right? And there's a lot of questions about how does one go about determining if it's a hymn or if it's just more poetic. That's one question, which I would say is sort of like a rhetorical or a linguistic sort of question. But then there's also the question, and this is probably where there's more sort of animating action, is whether or not, if it is a hymn, if it predates Paul. And so there's a lot of energy and scholarship around determining and arguing for or against this idea that either Paul is borrowing from an earlier tradition, or perhaps that Paul has created this. And sort of either way one goes down on this question, it's sort of recognizing that the language is more poetic, it's more exalted, it's different than how Paul writes elsewhere in Philippians. And so there's I highlight it as this is one of those places where you can come to very different conclusions about Paul and about early Christianity and about early views of the exaltation of Christ, depending on if you think Paul wrote this and is responsible for creating it, or if Paul is maybe borrowing and modifying a tradition that he's received. But for me, I guess with that aside, I think the sort of the model that it provides for Paul and for the Philippians is one of, I think you said narrative. Maybe you didn't say narrative. I think you said something else, Brennan. But that there is this, it's a pattern, that Jesus had privilege. Jesus had the highest privilege that he could possibly have had by existing in the very form of God. And that he didn't take advantage of that privilege for his own purposes. He didn't, use it in a way that would continue to be self-aggrandizing, but rather emptied himself. So there is a pattern of privilege, self-emptying, and then and then obedience that results in exaltation. And this is then going to be held up to the Philippians, who their sort of basic way of being is to get more and more status, right? That's to climb that ladder, to get higher. And he's saying this person who had all of the status didn't use it for his own gain, but used it as a way of serving others and emptying himself for the sake of others. And so the pattern of emptying and exaltation, I think, is a really significant part of this hymn. What about you, Jeanette?
Sometimes we just want to break out in song.
Yeah.
Right. No, I mean, I agree with what you're saying. And I think it's whether or not Paul wrote it or he didn't, in the form that we have it, we see that it's this beautiful poetic way in which Paul is using narrative and poetry to communicate what it means to his ethical instructions, and how he's trying to guide the church. He's using this form, and I think that's interesting. I'm just going to think of it like kind of practically, about how when we preach and teach, sometimes certain types of forms of communication can be very impactful and enable us to follow that movement and feel those movements, like that three-part structure or that pattern, in a way that if it was just prose or injunction or something, it would have a different effect. So that's just also something to think about when it comes to our own teaching and preaching.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, for just a second, and this is kind of off script, so we cannot respond to it at all, but I'm looking at some of the comments on Facebook Live, and I think that humility, the concept of humility, is probably one of the more misunderstood concepts in Christian circles, and yet the idea that Paul would hold up humility in a first century ancient context would also have been shocking. And so I wonder if we can talk just a little bit about, like, what do we mean by humility, and how might humility have been a sort of really surprising way for Paul to move forward as holding this up as a virtue rather than, something to be eliminated.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the first century, it'd be ridiculous to say that a god would take on the form of a slave.
Right.
I mean, even just beginning right there is extremely offensive and odd and disorienting. Why would anyone worship a slave, first of all? And then how would a divinity be venerated, like, and honored, if they didn't manifest like the most elite forms of humanity, like the emperor at minimum, right?
Yeah.
And so to think of Jesus taking on the form of the slave, it demonstrates, I think it was Elsa Thomas who said, it like divine solidarity. Yeah. People in the first century who were excluded from personhoods would be, from full personhood would be, and citizenship or significance would be male and female slaves. And to think of the crucified Messiah as one who willingly became slave, there is this profound sense of solidarity that can often, it's just something that we may not notice because the language of slave seems so foreign. Mm-hmm. And it is to Jesus, but he chooses to do that, right? And I think it's also important to think about humility in context of who is humbling oneself. To ask somebody who's already at the lowest strata of society to humble yourself is another form of exploitation. But to have a form of power, in Jesus' sense, he was fully entitled, the most entitled to be glorified and worshiped. He chooses to, rid himself of that entitlement. While here we are, we often feel so entitled, but, we have to call into question why, when Jesus doesn't, right? And so, if you're a leader, a person who's accustomed to power or to authority or to being kind of more on the top of the hierarchy, this is very humbling, or humiliating if you could see it, if you don't choose to humble yourself. But for those who are at the lowest strata of the society and in the church, because there is stratification in the churches, unfortunately, can be very empowering to know that Christ would take on the form of a slave. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something that struck me too. That just the kind of countercultural in a way element to this hymn. That there's a status and honor game that's constantly being played. I mean, in the ancient world, you can see it like in the inscriptions of buildings. Today, you can see it on the inscriptions on buildings. I mean, it seems like there's actually a lot of commonalities between the way that the kind of zero-sum game of honor, shame, or success and failure works, that people assume that you're either succeeding or you're failing, and those are the two options. And if you succeed, it's at the expense of others and their failure. I mean, that seems to be kind of common in our society. I mean, it seems like people, COVID kind of upsets this a bit in the sense that, like, we all have to kind of withdraw in order to help each other. But even that's running up against some pretty complicated politics and just personal choices these days, right? But this is an image that that I've found to be kind of interesting and instructive for my understanding of like ancient politics and this honor shame game. But this is the Gemma Augustea. This is a cameo that was like a beautiful stone that was carved in honor of Emperor Augustus, probably, who's the guy seated there shirtless on the top row. And those are like the gods kind of honoring Augustus Caesar. If you were an emperor, you were understood to have come close to or have been divinized, or after the fact, you kind of became a god. You were the pinnacle of human form. Notice is like in a ripped body and so on. And he looks beautiful, and he's being crowned with the savior oak leaves by economy herself, and Rome is sitting next to him, the personified, deified form of the city. And then like underneath, there's a second lower level is Roman soldiers and Roman other gods like Mercury and Diana beating up on foreign people. These are the barbarians that they would have thought of, the Germanic peoples that they were conquering and taking as slaves. And that like the honor of Rome like requires the abasement of these people understood to be, at least for ancient Roman purposes, understood to be kind of lesser people, right? And that this is kind of like how the whole game works. And it just strikes me that the notion that like what's understood to be kind of this kenotic, this word that to mean emptying oneself, that Christ changes the game, the rules of the game, as it were, because the person who's filled with the most honor actually chooses to identify and have solidarity, Jeanette, as you pointed out, with these with the margins, with the foreigners, with the poor, and so with people who have been excluded from this game. That's kind of the only way to upset the balance of the game. I have a colleague at CTS. I'm maybe shout out to a couple of colleagues. Mitzi Smith, a professor of New Testament, has written an article on slavery and enslavement and metaphors of enslavement. That is in our extra files, our extra resources. If you want to have access to those, feel free to sign up. It's free. But Dr. Smith's article is there, which goes into depth into the kind of use of this metaphor of enslavement and what the actual facts of slavery were in the ancient world. But then also I have a colleague, Dr. Marcia Riggs, who's an ethicist who talks a lot about conflict and conflict transformation. And something that strikes me about all this is the sense that if you want to play a different game, you have to change the rules of the game. I mean, you have to, in a way, you can't fight the same way that the emperor is going to fight in order to kind of win, because then what? So if there's going to be conflict transformation, there has to be kind of a different way of approaching the game. And humility is one way of kind of upending the dominant norms of this. So anyway, that and being humble to a cross, as you said, Jeanette, just the most shame-filled thing that could possibly be in the Roman world, right? To be crucified. That's this point of transformation in this narrative poem in a way. But in any event, that's just some of the things that jumped out at me about the poem. But then there's the exaltation too, right? Which what do you all take about this? The name, is the name Jesus, or is the name the Adonai? Is it the name of God? What is this name that everyone's gonna bend their knee at, and why is everyone bending their knee?
Yeah, so I think this is something that I think I learned from Steve Krafchick, who teaches New Testament at Candler. He was on my committee, and I think that there's good reason to ask these questions about, when Paul talks about Lord, which is, in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament is the translation for the unutterable name of God. But that when Paul uses the word Lord, it's not always clear if Paul is referring to Jesus or to God, the God of Israel. And he sort of says we might expect too much precision on the part of Paul. That maybe it's not as clear in Paul's mind, particularly he would talk about Romans 9 through 11, where Lord is almost used interchangeably of Jesus and the God of Israel. And not that Paul is confused, but maybe the distinction is one that we are pushing as subsequent readers of the text. And so I think I think that there is something in this idea that the name of God carries power, and that this name of God that has been bestowed upon Jesus is significant. And I guess where I would go is maybe I'm more, I don't know if we'll ever know exactly the name, but that the worship of Jesus is something that is divinely ordained. I think is significant, that the fact that every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus is Lord is not somehow a rival deity taking this upon himself, but that this is actually a result of God's decision and God's action in raising and exalting Jesus. And I think that's probably, for me at least, that's more significant than whether or not this is the name of the Lord, or what's behind it. I think for me, it's more of God is saying yes to this divine worship. This is divinely ordained, if we want to be very reformed about it. So that's kind of what my take on this, with just a few thoughts about it.
That's great.
And maybe I can ask another question about kind of humility, the self-emptying language. Mitzi Smith, who I mentioned earlier, who has an article on slavery, has pointed out that there's some problematic elements of the metaphor of slavery and enslavement. That is, Paul, a free man he is marginalized in some ways in the empire for his status as a Jew and what he's chosen to take on as his mission of following Jesus and preaching the gospel. But at the same time, he is relatively privileged, especially against people who are enslaved. But he uses this metaphor of enslavement in ways that kind of seem like it glorifies it a bit, which, of course, later Christians have used to justify slavery and defend their own theological approach to it. But also, there are a lot of feminist scholars who have pointed out that this message of emptying, of humility, the kenotic, self-emptying narrative is something that has been kind of put on certain groups of people more than it's been put on others. It's been assumed as something that women are supposed to do as a matter of course, but men may play a different game and so on. And it's lifted up and exalted sometimes in ways that might actually kind of humiliate or dehumanize people. There are also some other voices that say, well, there are ways to read this from a feminist perspective. So Sarah Coakley is someone who has done that. We have an article posted by Hannah Stewart that weighs these options and ends up coming up with a positive view. But what is your all's take on the kind of potential benefits and potential pitfalls of some of the language of self-emptying and humiliation and humility?
I think this might be that example of what earlier I was talking about with even like the language of foreignness in First Peter, being, a perpetual foreigner can work if that's something you're choosing to do and disidentifying from your former way of life where you're very at home. You're like choosing to not be at home in a place that you technically are. It affects different communities and persons differently. And I think that feminist, womanist readings and critiques give us an insight to how texts can be problematic and problematized. And it's not, Philippians 2:8 is pretty dangerous. Yeah. It's very beautiful and amazing, but it can be abused and misused when not read in context. And so I appreciate what Mitzi Smith is saying, and how Coakley also, she thinks kenosis is vital to to feminist or very compatible with and vital to distinctly what it means to the paradox.
Yeah.
The paradox of Christian life. And so I think I have no easy answer, because I think all you presented different views very well. And I think we need to hold that intention.
Right. Yeah.
And not neatly tie it all up. Because of the fact that historically speaking, in the history of interpretation and history of church, it has been used to only certain people have to self-empty, while others remain in their status and positions of power in the world and in the church. And so earlier, I think, so Elsa Tamaz, her recommendation to read that exhortation to empty oneself, you have to read it in light of who has power and who doesn't.
Yeah.
Right. And even like notions of being elect and set apart, chosen, like referring to First Peter, I can't help but talk about that text. Yeah. When you're on the underbelly of empire, it's a different impact than when you're the dominant religious majority. It has a very different impact on the way who you see yourself in that story. And so I think that it just offers some interpretive complexities that we shouldn't try to, do away with, but hold intention and kind of give us pause when we are too quick to figure out how to apply this easily and readily to all persons the same.
And I think one thing that's clear, and this probably goes without stating, but it's worth that the text says that Jesus made this choice to humble himself. And so
Right.
I would say any reading of this text that allows one person to say to another person, you need to humble yourself because that's the Christian thing to do, i.e. you need to take this lower place in family, society, church, whatever, that would be a misreading, that would be a dangerous and a violent reading of the text rather than one that is faithful. And again, I think that goes without saying, but I just know that in circles, some circles, this text, along with, the Ephesians text, has been used to say that women have a perpetual second place in the family or in society, and that the fact that it doesn't say God demanded that Jesus empty himself, right? That this is an act of Jesus's own love and choice. Really presses against any sort of command notion of this text that we have the right to tell someone else, you've got to humble yourself. You're not being Christ-like. That I think that's a violent misreading of the text.
Yeah, in a way, it has to be something that someone decides to do, at least in part, right? Otherwise, it's not part of this canonic story of self-emptying if it's forced on someone or demanded of someone, right? But perhaps I can ask another question. The Gorman reading that we had on our site, this New Testament scholar, Michael Gorman, said that the hymn is Paul's master narrative, that this is like the gospel in miniature in a way. And Chris, I was wondering if you had any thoughts about, the story of kind of Christ pre-existing as kind of part of God or equal to God, and then deciding to let go, deciding not to exploit or seize that relationship with God, becoming low and dying on the cross, and then being raised up. Does this work as kind of like the gospel in miniature for Paul?
Yeah, so Michael Gorman is a New Testament scholar who taught for a long time. I think he recently retired, and I'm not going to remember off the top of my head his institutional affiliation, but he's written several books about the Christ hymn, or about the kenosis, self-emptying Christology, and we'll argue that this is sort of everywhere in Paul's letters. And I think, as is the case with a lot of New Testament scholars, that's where people begin to sort of press him and say, I don't see it everywhere. I don't see it in all of the places. What struck me as I was reading through this passage again this morning, and with the help of a commentary by Marcus Bachmuel, is even if we don't say that this is Paul's master narrative, and I tend to be sort of very hesitant to think that we can recover anything of Paul's master narrative. I think his works are him doing theology. I don't know if we have access to Paul's theology sort of in its naked form. But what I would say is just how similar this poem is to the depiction of Jesus in the Gospels. And now, of course, the Gospels are written probably as many as 20 or 30 years after Paul has written to the Philippians. But this idea that we see in Mark 10 about Jesus came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for others seems to be one of the most consistent threads throughout the New Testament, that this whether we call it self-emptying or whether we call it service of others, whether we, Jesus washing his disciples' feet in the Gospel of John, it just seems like this really powerful image that what I think the hymn helps us see is that it starts with this very high identity of Jesus, that Jesus was in the form of God, and that makes the most sense of the Gospels, that if we read the Gospels sort of through the sense that Jesus didn't earn divinity in his life, but his life is a demonstration of this life of self-emptying, I think is powerful. Again, I think that there's some clarity that comes with Gorman's thesis, and then there's also places where I don't necessarily see it. A whole other can of worms with Gorman's thesis is that if it is Paul's master narrative, then the exaltation piece is also part of the ethical instruction for Christians, and he'll get into discussions of divination of believers, apotheosis, or what the Greek, the Eastern Church would talk about, sort of living into the identity of God. That's what Christian progress is becoming more and more godlike. And so that not only do Christians share in the abasement, but that they would then share also in the glorification of God, which again is an interesting thesis, probably for another day.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's and so again, those readings are on our course website, and feel free to follow along. There's also a syllabus on there if you want to follow along for next week. So we are at about 6 minutes until we are wrapping up here. Are there any sort of last things that you all want to point out? For me, I think that, working out your own salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, this kind of great paradox, that salvation is something that we don't fully have yet, or it's not fully here, but that we in this position of, I think fear and trembling, at least as an Old Testament professor, I read this as kind of the fear of the Lord, this kind of posture of humility, and posture of really kenosis, what's being spelled out here in the Christ hymn, taking this posture of humility with respect to God, will in a way that's the beginning of wisdom or something like that. But that God is at work kind of in us to do all these things. It's a gift and it's a kind of a task for us. That kind of combination is an interesting thing for me. But what are some final takeaways from you all? Like, what do you when you read Paul's exhortations here and the Christ hymn together, what are you left with in a way?
Well, I think it kind of brings us back to what it means to live in a manner worthy of the gospel. That part of that, I think you asked, thought about the question, what is the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think that's something to think about. What does that mean to live in a manner worthy of the gospel? And I think it might mean, I think, to live in gracious, knowing that what God has done for us in Christ Jesus was an act. It was not just, we proclaim it and we live in that, and that it's not only humility that we're talking about, but if at the end every knee will bow and tongue will confess, and there's no divine rivalry between God and his son, God the Father and his son, but there's also emperors and other authorities and the other forms of abuse and forms of power, that those two will bow down, that those forms will acknowledge who Jesus Christ is. And that does result in fear and trembling. Right? Salvation, that Christ is Savior. And in the end, that everyone will know it. And so we live into that salvation as we live on this side of heaven.
I love that.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, to me, that upending that picture of what salvation means, or what peace means, right, that Rome offered, but also what people are looking to today for salvation and peace will one day be upended, right? And what we will find is that serving others, doing nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, regarding others as people who are made wonderfully and fearfully in the image of God, and that we should serve and love those who we come into contact with. I mean, that is going to end up being revealed as the way. I mean, that is going to, that would cause a lot of fear and trembling. It's even caused fear and trembling, just to imagine a different economic system in the wake of COVID. So that would be a real upending. Chris, what about you?
Yeah, I think, one of the things I think I'm struck with, and again, it's this idea of living worthily of the gospel. And I think this represents my own sort of theological baggage, so I apologize in advance for that. But I think that there tends to be a very moralizing understanding of what that might look like, and there's low-lying fruit that go with that, right? Like sexual immorality is like the first thing that people throw out as, that's what it means to live worthily. And I just think that a text like this demands so much more of us. Not that doesn't matter, but I think that in some circles, what happens is if you can sort of check the box that you're not having sex with everything that moves, then you're fine. and that what Paul is actually advocating for is far harder: to live life together in community, to model another way of being political, another way of using power, another way of organizing yourself and your communities is far more costly and difficult than some of these more moralizing interpretations. And so I find myself challenged, even what's my list of like my checklist of things that I'm not doing that make me feel superior, rather than this really costly demand of modeling in my own life. This self-giving love and pointing, working for the good of others, considering the needs of others, is again something I'm just so drastically challenged by, and would want people to be challenged by as well. I'm just challenged by it. That's what I would say.
Amen. Well said.
Yeah, and just one of the comments, Mary Catherine Robinson says, I think we see Paul's theology evolving throughout his letters, but this Christ hymn seems to me like Paul is finally realizing that this message is more important than anything else. And that is interesting to reflect. I mean, perhaps Philippians is written quite late, but that for Paul, this message of this particular kind of unity seems to take on a life of its own in Philippians. So in any event, thank you. Jeanette, final words, final thoughts? Oh,
well,
sorry.
The sun has finally come up on my side of this country, so I'm gonna go hit the hay now.
That sounds good. Hey, thank you so much for joining us, for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge, not just of Philippians, but also of 1 Peter. I recommend, by the way, if you go on YouTube, you can search Jeanette Oak's name, and you can find wonderful speeches and sermons and lectures that she's given at Azusa Pacific, but also check out her articles on Working Preacher, check out her book on Amazon. And Jeanette, thank you so much. And we look forward to hanging out with you again sometime soon.
See you later, guys. It was a great time. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jeanette. Hey, real quick, Brendan, before we leave, just for those that are still watching, a reminder that next week we will be joined by another specialist in 1 Peter, when Reverend Dr. Shively Smith will be joining with us for our discussion of the next section of Philippians. So very much looking forward to it.
You don't want to miss.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we're so grateful that you were with us this morning, and we're going to have another amazing guest next week. So very, very grateful for this time.
Jeanette, peace be with you. Get some sleep.
Yeah, peace, everyone.
See you soon.